We continue the story now from the Hebrew Scriptures in verse 14. Listen for a word from God. Joab said, "I will not waste time like this with you." He took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Later, the Cushite came to the king, and the Cushite said, "Good tidings for my lord the king, for the Lord has vindicated you this day, delivering you from the power of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man, Absalom?" The Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to do you harm be like that young man." The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, Absalom! Would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Please pray with me. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. David got what was coming to him because of his misdeeds, because of his failures, because of his love of power. The sword that the prophet said would not depart from his house took what he loved the most. First one son, then another. Absalom, whose name means father of peace, dies at the hands of his father's war machine. David reaped what he sowed. That's one way to look at this story. And it's definitely a part of it. The lure of public office brings with it the seductions of many kinds and potentials for abuse. Whatever you put out into the world will come back around to bite you. Yet the biblical tradition isn't content with a simple moralistic tale, is it? It wants to give us something more honest, something more real, more nuanced than the dualistic ways that we tend to treat those in the public limelight. David weeps for his son. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." My son repeated 5 times in 2 sentences. The tradition wants us to see that underneath the public titles, underneath the powerful office, underneath the demands of public life, there is always just a person who hurts like you hurt, a person who hopes like you hope, a person who tries to love like you try to love, a person who grieves like you grieve. All the armor in the world couldn't change that for David. The tradition reminds us of this, perhaps because often in the face of grief, we try to paper it over or clean it up. We try to use what power we have to sweep loss under the rug. Unfortunately, this is often, maybe even especially true of people of faith. We sometimes take our theologies of hope and wield them like giant candle snuffers over people whose pain we fear. Kate Bowler takes on this kind of misdirected theological practice in her book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. especially in the appendix, where she compiles a list of things she says you should never say to people experiencing terrible times. My top 3 favorites include, number 1, it's going to get better, I promise. What are you going to say when it doesn't, in fact, get better, Bowler asks. Number 2, God needed an angel. Bowler says this one makes God look sadistic and needy, and angels in the tradition are not dead people, but are created from scratch. And number 3, everything happens for a reason. When someone is drowning, Bowler writes, the only thing worse than failing to throw them a life preserver is handing them a reason. Serene Jones, in her book, Trauma and Grace, reflects that many trauma survivors either get stuck in tricks of the mind where loss is forthrightly rejected or repressed, or in depression where the mind turns loss into an object of relentless reflection. In between these 2 poles of repression and depression lies mourning, she says. Mourning. A disposition, she writes, in which your heart and mind give into the loss and consent to dwell in the trauma with as much attention as can be mustered. It requires, she says, acknowledging how much was lost, how deeply it matters, how unstable the world has become in the aftermath, and how difficult it feels to be ever moving forward. As I find myself this morning dealing with my own loss of my dear mentor and friend, Bishop Douglas Miles, I can feel that desire to swing from one of those poles Serene Jones writes about to the other. Like many people who are grieving, I had an extra adult beverage or 2 this week trying to dull the pain of the reality that he is not with us. That one week we were texting and calling and meeting, and the next I can't pick up the phone and solicit his guidance. This friend who has prayed with me, walked with me, counseled me, consoled me, agitated me, taught me. I want to repress that pain. Or I find myself at the other pole, my mind racing. What happened on that OR table? Why didn't they know? Why didn't I call and take this surgery more seriously? Why didn't I prepare more for this? And yet when I allow my heart and mind to acknowledge how much is lost, as Serene Jones writes, and how deeply it matters to me, there is not much more to do but sit in the tears. A second great mentor erased from my phone contacts. One I called whenever I didn't know what to do or struggled with my own sense of inadequacy and fear in the pastorate or the public life. His laughter that reminded me not to take myself too seriously. The friend who never let me forget that an organization that so many of us help build together is a lot like the church. Not first about the work, but first about the people. Serene Jones says that grief is the hardest of all emotions because its demands are so excruciating. It requires a willingness, she says, to bear the unbearable. As mourning, it requires turning private agony into public shared loss. The gift of mourning, she writes, is that fully awakening to the depth of loss enables you to at least learn that you can hold the loss. You can bear terrors of heart and body and still see your way forward with eyes open. And when we can get to that place, she writes, eventually, wonder can appear. the simple capacity to behold the world around you and within you, to be awed by its mystery, to be made curious by its difference, and to marvel at its compelling form. And this is not just wonder in the face of beauty, she writes, but also wonder at the ugly and the gruesome, like the cross. But to reach this place requires that you become vulnerable to the object that you behold. It's remarkable that in this David story, the tradition doesn't silence David's awful grief. Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. The tradition doesn't silence the grief or clean it up or paper it over. It invites us to sit with it, to feel David's pain. And though we have seen David grieve deep losses before, when we witness David grieving for his loved Jonathan, that grief was poetic. The words grew from the page like beautifully cultivated flowers, trimmed and presented for the public to see. Here, the grief is raw and painful. It hurts. And because it hurts, it is real. Perhaps we are invited to see that David can, in fact, hold the loss. That there will be the possibility of life beyond it. Life and possibility, which is the gift that mourning can eventually bring. The wonder to observe how we can hold losses of so many kinds and yet still find beauty and life and love. But the only way to get there is through the tears that David shed, raw, full, uncensored. A couple of years ago, I saw that kind of possibility on the streets of West Baltimore, not far from where I now live. A young man, like so many in our city, was murdered, cut down by gunfire. The grandson of a leader in build, rumors floated that he was in the game, caught in the drug trade. I could see some kind of Davidic thoughts passing through the heads of leaders who learned more about his death. Maybe he had in some way reaped what he had sowed. An impromptu street vigil was announced. I showed up alongside a few leaders, so did Bishop Miles. When we got there, the grief on the faces of this young man's young friends was palpable. The air smelled of weed. Marijuana blunts passed around as this young man's friends tried to soothe some of the pain of their loss. One after another, preachers took the megaphone to try to comfort the family and so many angry and hurt friends. Honestly, we all tried to clean it up. God this, God that. Offering comfort that is a definite part of our tradition. And then the megaphone was passed to Bishop Miles. And he pointed it toward the sky and said, "Why, God? Where are you? How could you let this happen? We're angry, Lord." I watched the crowd shift, the young men leaning in to listen to someone actually speaking to them. I felt it in my gut like we were suspended between heaven and earth in some dangerous sort of conversation where God might be more than a pill that we take to deaden the pain, but a real force capable of listening. "We're in pain here," Bishop cried out. "We need your presence and power among us." Of anything spoken that night, Bishop Miles' prayer is the only one I remember. Raw, unedited grief modeled as a gift for teenagers, permission to pray what they really felt to a God who might just listen. If you read on in the story today, Joab, the ruthless top advisor who does his job to keep David in power, criticizes David for this display of grief. You can't grieve like that, he tells David, and expect to stay in power. Once again, the demands of the office seem to strip David of his humanity. The text quickly silences David's grief, pushes him back into performing the public role. Perhaps this is the cost of the public life, and the text wants to be honest about it. Or perhaps this is the bargain that we all seek to strike in one way or another in the face of overwhelming grief, repression, or depression, anything to avoid grief, the most difficult of all emotions. But for a moment, we saw beneath the veneer. For a moment, we saw David vulnerable and hurting, just like everyone else. For a moment, we saw the awful cost of love, a cost that we all have to pay in one way or another if we want to live. All the armor in the world couldn't change that. And yet love is a gift that is worth the cost. Perhaps that is the best way to sum up the nature of our God, or the argument that our tradition wants to make in the life of our God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, the God who loves us so much that it hurts. In just a moment, we'll ordain a couple of deacons who are stepping in mid-year. The deacons decided we couldn't wait to fill these positions because we're all holding so much loss in one way or another in these difficult times. Deacons are responsible for organizing the ministry of compassion. And we need to be compassionate with ourselves and with each other as the ground beneath us continues to shift in ways that threaten to isolate us from each other. A recurring conversation that comes up among deacons is what to say to people in various situations of loss or transition. It's always a fruitful conversation. I like to go back to the root of the word compassion, to suffer with. To suffer with. It is the antidote to slipping toward one of those two poles of repression or depression. To suffer with, which is another way to say not leaving anyone alone. It is the gift that we can try to give to each other. It is also the promise of our God, the God who is vulnerable enough to hear whatever prayer rises to our lips and to sit with us through every loss and the morning that comes.